If we could all come into the meeting room here, we'll get started. My name is Bill Donohue. I am the Associate General Counsel for Exelon Corporation. My areas of responsibility are health, environment, and safety. And I've been heavily involved and actively involved in just about all of the major environmental regulations, whether they be air, water, or solid hazardous waste. I've participated in a number of these conferences for power experts, and I just think they're wonderful. They're wonderful in many ways, as a way for the industry representatives and vendor representatives who provide the technologies to meet and interact, to exchange information, the latest technological advances. It's a way for, as you'll see on the panel, for policymakers to interact with those in the affected regulated communities, and also, again, to determine and learn about what are the technological capabilities in so many of these regulations in which EPA what's the term, technology forcing, where they'll set a goal and say, don't worry about it, we're sure we'll get there with the technology. Parenthetical, carbon capture and sequestration. So these are just wonderful opportunities, and I encourage you all to take advantage of the opportunities that are here. We have a very knowledgeable panel or group of speakers over these next 2 days that, and I hope you'll avail yourselves of the opportunity to tap into all of that expertise, experience, and to network to the max, if you will. My apologies for being late. I could make up some excuse about my flight landing after midnight last night, which it did, or the fact that I didn't think Indiana was on daylight savings time, so I was actually, thought I had an extra hour, but the fact of the matter is I just misread the agenda and decided to sort of wander down here about 8 o'clock to make sure that everything was in order. And I met my friend Lucas, who said, you're on, and on top of that, you're speaking for half an hour. So I'm appreciative that my friend John Kinsman here from EEI is going to provide some moral support, if not some substantive support. But in any event, before we start, I would like to go over a few safety rules. If we are required to evacuate the building, go to one of the doors that's marked exit, not these doors behind us, because I don't believe that gets us to a fire escape or exits from the building. Once you go outside, there will be stairs that you can go down to in order to exit the building. It's always good to have sort of a meeting place, so why don't we all agree to meet out front, sufficient distance from the building, but so that we're not in harm's way, but at least have a meeting place we can make sure that everybody's accounted for. Should the need arise, there is an automatic external defibrillator down at the front desk. So with those safety messages. One other safety message, if I could, since I'm a relatively recent grandfather. I now have 4 grandchildren, but we'd like to go to a lot of amusement parks and things like that. And I once heard a safety message that was great. They said, when you're going in with family members, et cetera, where people might get lost, et cetera, and that first question people ask, well, what do they look like and what do they have on? Somebody recommended one time that just take your cell phone and take a picture of the children, so that you've got something that's online, it's digital and can be used in the event, in the very hopefully unforeseen or unlikely event that someone gets separated and you have to do that. So I thought that was a pretty cool piece of advice as well. Okay, well, in terms of setting the scene for the next few days, and I'm just going to hit some of the highlights, which our speakers will elaborate on in more detail, certainly. To say that when we look at energy law and environmental law, which in my view are two sides of the same coin, when I hear people say this country doesn't have an energy policy, I say, well, we actually do have one by default. It's the regulations that are being crafted by the Environmental Protection Agency and pursuant to enabling legislation and the requirements of the states frequently to carry out these federal mandates. We do have an energy policy. May not be sequenced properly, may be out of sequence. We might be trying to fit square pegs into round holes, as with the Clean Power Plan regulations under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. But nonetheless, we do have a policy which is in effect, is having direct and significant effect on the energy sector, both mobile transportation and stationary source power generation. And it's also driving very real and substantial material changes, not only in the portfolio of power options that are available, whether that be fossil fuel, nuclear, or renewables, wind, solar, hydro, thermal, et cetera, so that there are policies in play that are affecting how electricity gets generated, how it gets used. There are a number of state statutes and requirements on utilities around renewable portfolio standards, requirements to implement energy efficiency programs, load reduction during peak hours, to make the power grid available for renewables that are online, distributed generation, et cetera. And so we have all of that happening in terms of how it's generated and how it's used, and also how it's delivered. We've all heard about the smart grid, the electric utility of the future, very interactive involvement between customers and the transmission and distribution companies. There's a online technology that's being installed in consumers, in residential customers' houses that can provide real-time pricing, and hopefully will lead to a more cost-efficient way that energy is used. The things that can be done during off-peak hours will be done during off-peak hours. That kind of thing, as provided or as incentivized by pricing of the power. So we are very much in a sea change here, and of course, anytime a society or segment of society goes through what really is transformative change. I mean, you can't get much more transformative than where we are in industry now when you look at generation, transmission, distribution, and energy usage. There's going to be disruptions, I guess. Maybe that's an economist term, but there's going to be transitional issues. What happens with the coal plants, particularly, can they meet the greenhouse gas standards that are temporarily on hold? And we'll see how that plays out, and we'll have a lot more to talk about that. We have Janet McCabe, the Assistant Administrator for AIR tomorrow, to give us a first-hand look at where the EPA is, even though the rule was stayed. What is the EPA doing in terms of continuing to develop policy? So obviously, so this has had a very major impact on fossil fuel generation. Both positive and negative in terms of closure and retirement of coal plants, the need to put on very costly pollution control technology to enable to continue running under the mercury and air toxics rule, constant resetting or readjusting criteria pollutant standards. We're now in the midst of looking at the implementation of the Cross-State Air Pollution Act rule after many years of litigation and restated and amended regulations. But it's not only the coal industry, the nuclear industry is very much impacted by this. As many of you know, Exelon's the largest nuclear power generator in the country. We have already made the decision to close our Oyster Creek nuclear plant in New Jersey 10 years ahead of the expiration of its NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission license. That was done not for air reasons, but because the state was requiring that we retrofit the plant with closed cycle cooling towers. And having worked on that project firsthand and sort of been the public face in a lot of the hearings, it's an issue that drives a lot of debate. So this is about more than just the air regulations. I will talk tomorrow. There's I believe a TBD topic after lunch. I'm going to use that to look more in depth at water regulations, particularly cooling water intake structures and 316B, 316A thermal discharge limitations, and also the notorious waters of the U.S. or clean water regulation, which is also stayed right now. So it's impacting industries. It's transformative. John will be able to tell you about the numerous and comprehensive discussions that go on in the trade association, Edison Electric Institute. The environmental / energy issues are front and center. There's also an impact on regulated markets. Those states that are those companies that operate in regulated markets. There's all sorts of dynamics going on in those markets that impact the price of electricity and also the capacity market, which ensures that there's enough power to meet future demands, and the PJM capacity market auctions, et cetera. We believe there's some distortion there around prices because of subsidies that are provided mainly in form of the production tax credit for wind. Enables them to actually bid their plants in at negative pricing and still make a very fair rate of return on those on their investments. So there's all sorts of policy issues in the regulated markets. Regulators in the regulated states are struggling with what is the generation portfolio going to look like. Are they going to approve projects? Are they going to approve these pollution control projects, smart grids, et cetera? So I'm getting the move it along sign. All right. So needless to say, it's transformative. It's changing, and the good news is that there's a lot of opportunity there, and the better news is that there's a lot of very talented and knowledgeable and experienced people that will enable us to gain greater insights into into these issues. Our next speaker is John Kinsman, who is the Senior Director, Environment of the Edison Institute. John occupies a role in terms of public policy development for the trade association. I believe John focuses primarily on air matters. And I've heard John speak at these conferences before, and I think you'll find that he is a highly informed expert on these issues in terms of the public policy space and where regulations are going, et cetera. John?
Thanks, Bill. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I want to ask the audience to indicate with the hands up if you consider yourself fairly knowledgeable on Clean Air Act matters. And keep your hand up if you consider yourself very knowledgeable, very knowledgeable. Okay, that's some good context for me. We're going to go over, of course, with the electric power sector focus, the Clean Air Act, and some of the drivers that we're facing, and many of them you will have heard of it, even if you're not a Clean Air Act junkie. I have to preface these remarks by saying that the changes that we'll hear about from Paul and Joe from the electric power company perspective are causing amazing emission reductions. I mean, of course, driven by the Clean Air Act requirements that we've seen develop over the past 20 years. But our SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, for the industry as a whole are down 86% since 1990. 86%. NOx, nitrogen oxide emissions, down 79% for the industry since 1990. That is phenomenal, unbelievable. You just couldn't see this happening 5 or 10 years ago. And before I leave that, we're going to talk about mercury, particulate matter. Mercury reductions with the mercury in air toxic standard are projected to be 90%. Particulate matter, we're already way over 90%. There are many environmental challenges that the industry faces, some bigger than others. In the air arena, climate arena, water, land and natural resources, water, chemical management. We're only going to focus on air and to a small degree climate today. At least I will be focusing. There are many drivers facing our industry, and they not only include environmental regulations, but low natural gas price, the cost of wind and solar plummeting, the need for a balanced and diverse fuel mix, state policies, which vary all over the place, financial considerations, customer demand, new technologies. The electric power sector, yes, we have kind of three main focus themes right now: clean energy, modernizing the grid, and providing customer solutions. And again, 5 years ago, you would never be able to predict what's happened with wind, with solar, with electric transportation. I heard a presentation yesterday about electric bus has 9-year lifetime on the battery. And if you go with this total electric, and when you consider the emissions that come from the generation of the power to drive that electric bus, I don't know how they make this calculation, but they were saying 22 miles to the gallon. The diesel version of that bus, 4 miles to the gallon. These changes are phenomenal. I'm sure we'll hear much more about them. Okay, so there are many Clean Air Act activities underway, starting with the greenhouse gas regulation, which is under the Clean Air Act, especially the Clean Power Plan. There's Interstate Transport. There are national ambient air quality standards. Ozone and SO2 are the most important ones for the power sector right now. There's the regulation of mercury and hazardous air pollutants. There is something called regional haze, which maybe this might be a fairly new topic for many of you. Modeling, monitoring issues. Let's get greenhouse gases out of the way. This is the really huge driver. And I'll get to the Clean Power Plan on a subsequent slide, but let's just say that the administration is not only working on the Clean Power Plan, they're working on methane regulation, for the oil and gas sector and just came out with new source performance standards. But they're beginning the process of getting to at existing sources with a goal of 40%-ish reduction in methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas from oil and gas activities. And of course, they're starting out aircraft regulation. There's the Paris International Agreement in Paris, where the president will enter into the agreement, which is, I think, a 26 to 28% reduction in national greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 compared to 2005, if I remember correctly. Congress isn't doing a whole lot there, and if it did pass any legislation, the president would probably veto it. States are doing all sorts of things, and I think everyone is of the view that prudency suggests the need for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, regardless of the uncertainties about changing climate. We've already reduced our emissions in the power sector from 2005 to 2015 from 2.4 billion tons of CO2 to 1.9 billion tons of CO2, 2.4 to 1.9 from 2005 to present. Part of that reason is pretty clear from this pie chart. You can see the coal generation from 2005 versus 15 going from 49% to 34%. Natural gas going from 18% in 2005 to 32% in 2015. Non-hydro renewables, solar and wind, going from 2% to 7%. That explains a lot of the CO2 reduction. So the Clean Power Plan. This came out as a final regulation in 2015, but the most impactful environmental regulation in the history of EPA, without a doubt, if it survives the court scrutiny. And there has been a rather radical development of the litigation status over the last couple months. Essentially, originally the DC Circuit was going to hear in a 3-person panel in the beginning of June arguments about the Clean Power Plan and whether it was legal, whether EPA overstepped the bounds of the Clean Air Act, whether EPA's proposal laid out enough details that the final rule could actually have been foreseen. But the Supreme Court trumped the DC Circuit. And this was pre the passing of Justice Scalia, which this would not have happened now because there's only 8 members of the Supreme Court, and it would have been a 4-4 tie. But back when it happened, they decided to stay the rule. The DC Circuit had not stayed the rule, which caused quite a bit of impact. Essentially, states don't have to put in their plans in September of this year. And then the DC Circuit, instead of holding this 3-judge panel argument at the beginning of June, decided to do an en banc or incomplete DC Circuit argument in September, minus two members who decided for various reasons not to participate. So late September is when we will have the DC Circuit, basically the full DC Circuit, hear the arguments on this. And regardless of that outcome, unless it's a stunningly unanimous decision, the Supreme Court later on will hear things. And so the DC Circuit is probably going to have a decision by the early 2017. The Supreme Court will take another almost year. So we're not going to have the final say on the legality of the Clean Power Plan until very late 2017 or early 2018. In the meantime, EPA is continuing to work with states that want to talk, and they're continuing to work on grayer aspects of the Clean Power Plan, but not requirement-related aspects. And many states are in what they call pencils down status, where they're not doing a single thing. Many states are continuing to work on developing their responses to the Clean Power Plan. And EPA most people will say that EPA can work on the softer edges of this. The stay only applies to EPA. But there's some debate about that. So moving on to interstate transport. This is related to national ambient air quality standards. Primarily, ozone and particulate matter are the concerns. And EPA has had a series of interstate transport rules. You might say that the Congress's acid rain programs kicked this all off. And then there was the Clean Air Act interstate rule and the cross-state air pollution rule and the cross-state air pollution update rule. And EPA is going to finalize the last of those this fall. It's basically an eastern U.S. program to reduce NOx during the ozone season of May through September. And it's a fairly hard-hitting rule for many states because the final rule will be out in the end of this summer, and they'll have to comply next May. And EPA is the biggest issue, I think, that across the industry is the fact that EPA has proposed to dramatically limit the emissions trading of NOx under the program in various ways. But the interesting thing here is that EPA is actually starting to apply this outside of the eastern U.S. EPA recently used the modeling developed for this eastern U.S. rule, and it rejected a Utah approach to dealing with interstate transport in the West, saying that Utah was contributing to ozone non-attainment in Denver, and they actually said that 4 other states were in that boat. Which leads to the next slide. That interstate transport program was related to the 2008 Ozone Standard, but we just have a new 2015 Ozone Standard, and there will be, starting this fall, activity by EPA to work out the details of how states will have to deal with the interstate transport of NOx related to the 2015 Ozone Standard. So they're going to be putting out a bunch of modeling, trying to link what they believe will be non-attainment areas to upwind states that influence those non-attainment areas. And then 2018 states will have to put in plans, or more likely EPA will come up with another rule. And the interesting thing about what will happen in 2018 is that we probably will have some attention outside of the eastern U.S., and we probably will have some attention to non-electric generators for the first time. There are many national ambient air quality standards. The most important to utilities are ozone, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. There are many activities going on. EPA is supposed to, every 5 years, review the standards and update them if necessary. They almost always do. And then there's a million steps in implementing each of them. And I am going to really gloss over this detail, which I think you will have the slides later on. But basically, EPA is working with states towards determining which of the areas fail the ozone standard, the new ozone standard, to be finalized by fall of 2017, and then all sorts of requirements will kick in. And states, depending on how far out of attainment they are, will have various amounts of time, from just a few years to a long period of time if they fail the standard by a wide margin to meet the new standards. But by then, we'll have probably tightened the standard another 2 or 3 times. SO2 NAAQS implementation, there are really 4 stages of this. This is a 2010 standard. It's very much delayed in its implementation. The key things to take home here are that EPA's proposed that about 60 or so areas fail the standard and would have to revise their state plans based on simply emissions from large electric generators. Actually, I'm misreading this from here. It's really, there were about 60 areas that they had to consider, and only 12 of them clearly have to do something, which is a surprise and a good result for the electric power sector. But there are several other rounds, and essentially EPA and states have to work together to determine whether future non-attainment decisions are dealt with modeling or monitoring. If you're a Clean Air Act junkie, you know all about this. It's been very controversial. But some of these decisions on whether an area fails or meets the standard are not going to be made until around 2020, 10 years after the standard was put in place, because of controversy about the ability of and quality of air quality modeling, essentially. So there are many other rulemakings that are underway regarding the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which you can read about in the slides later on. I will say that Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, did pass some legislation just last week, which is, in my opinion, going nowhere. So don't get too excited if you thought these were really cool things, because the president would not sign this into law. It would essentially delay the implementation of the 2015 Ozone Standard by about a decade. It would then delay or expand the time for EPA to reconsider reconsider revision of future national ambient air quality standards from 5 to 10 years. And it would change the basis on which the agency has to decide on whether to tighten or not standards. But this is, all those things are fairly controversial, and this will not become law. So hazardous air pollutants. This has been a huge issue for our industry. And we're living under a rule called the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards to deal with mercury and acid gases and non-mercury metals. And basically we have to reduce mercury and sulfur dioxide and particulate matter to comply. And all of the facilities now, except for 5, which have gained 1 more year of extension, are regulated. Many facilities had a 1-year extension until April 16th of 2016 this year. But they're all regulated now. They all have to comply. Been many coal plants that have been retired as a result of this rule. And as I say, five facilities have 1 more year, and for reasons such as they needed to complete a transmission line, or more time is needed while a natural gas combined cycle unit is completed, for a unit to continue operating for 1 year before it shuts down. It needed to keep going for reliability purposes while something else is happening. EPA came out with a rule addressing lots of technical corrections, which has been teed up for a long time. Finally came out, didn't deal with all the issues, but did make some important improvements. Even though this is a 2012 regulation, it's still being litigated on many fronts. And there was a Supreme Court decision that EPA should have considered cost in the original decision to regulate the electric power sector. And EPA, as a result, put out a report that mined its earlier analyses. And states and industry were not happy with that report, so the litigation continues, and they're both at the DC Circuit level, and they're taking another run at the Supreme Court to invalidate the rule. In the meantime, virtually every facility in the United States affected by this is already implementing, taking action to comply. Many other smaller but important issues are still being litigated on this 2012 rule. But ahead, in around 2020, EPA is going to have to go through some continued evaluation of whether more is needed to regulate for controlling hazardous air pollutant emissions, and whether the technologies are improving. So around 2012, a couple of reports are due that will be pretty important. So regional haze, I said this is maybe a sleeper issue for some of you. The key issues here are that EPA has a program where they are driving down, and this is a regulatory decision, emissions from all sources to the point where in 2064, there will be no man-made impairment of visual air quality. So in 10-year increments, states are planning. And the first plan was through 2018, and now we're talking about the rules of the road for 2019 and after. In the meantime, in the period through 2018, the first planning period, EPA has made many, many state decisions, many of them related to something called Best Available Retrofit Technology, or BART. And many of them have been controversial, but EPA is getting towards the final actions in states. And oftentimes, what you're arguing about is whether implementing hundreds of millions of dollars of retrofit controls, or even a couple billion, will get you any visible air quality improvement. This is the impact from affected Texas electric generator of $2 billion of EPA controls, baseline and with the controls, and you can't see much improvement here. So controversial, lots of litigation on these regional haze decisions. There's a key issue related to the cross-state air pollution rule, where states can say in the eastern U.S. that best available retrofit technology requirements are met through compliance with the cross-state air pollution rule. And finally, litigation is moving forward on this issue, and next February final briefs, but that means we won't have a decision maybe till summer or so. So summer of 2017, we might know if the status of this particular rule, which meant that throughout the eastern U.S., individual power plants did not have to be considered for source-specific best available retrofit technologies. If the court makes a wrong decision here, it's going to be a mess. Wait till late 2017 to see if we have a real mess on our hands, where EPA has to go back and work with states on assessing power plant by power plant SO2 and NOx controls related to visibility. Don't have to do it now, and hopefully we won't have to do it later. EPA is now has just put out a proposal to define how states will deal with regional haze from 2019 through 2064. There's a couple of controversial things in here, a couple of good things in here. Comments are due on July 5th. The only issue I'll raise is that federal land managers, which would be, for example, the National Park Service or the U.S. Forest Service managing a national park or a wilderness area, can basically tell a state that they find a link between visual air quality and the impact of a source or a small number of sources called reasonably attributable visibility impairment, or RAVI. And basically, if the federal land manager makes a certification, the state has to revise their state plan. There's no discussion. They just have to revise their state plan, even if the state finds that no controls are needed. It's kind of ridiculous. And then EPA is saying that the federal land managers can use all sorts of new tools, like modeling. And the modeling doesn't necessarily have to show a visual air quality improvement or a direct relationship. That's probably the most controversial aspect of this, the granting of a lot of power to park managers and wilderness managers to over the states. The states their power is being diminished in this rule. Air quality modeling. I'm going to basically say the EPA has come out with new requirements for air quality modeling. This is very important for implementation of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, for regional haze, for permitting individual sources. EPA generally comes out and says which models are preferred, which ones are the ones that they think should be used. In this case, they have not really chosen for something called photochemical grid modeling which models should be preferred, which kind of makes things a lot more difficult, really. And they basically are taking away one of the major regional haze models and saying that's no longer a preferred model. And they're going to hopefully come out with a parallel process for screening out sources with lower emissions so they don't have to go through permitting. It's called a MERP approach. I think it's called modeled emission rate precursors. And if that works, that's great. But there have been other attempts to do this in the past that have been turned over by the courts because environmental groups are not real enthused with letting anybody off the hook. We don't know how this is going to work out. We don't know whether EPA will pick emission limits that will mean that a lot of sources would be able to screen out and not have to do the modeling, or whether it will survive a court challenge. And if it does neither, and EPA hasn't put out approved models or preferred models, then every single modeling exercise is going to have to go through EPA one by one, at least at the beginning, and it will be a big time sap and resource sap, and it'll take a lot of time. I think the last issue I'm going to leave you with is just some caution about the fact that there are a lot of low-cost sensors that are being developed by very reputable companies, and the data's getting better and better, and they can be used at fence lines, they can be used to identify hotspots, they can be used by industry to help identify where they should put more rigorous or standard monitors. But nevertheless, the community, the public is being empowered with these monitors that they can actually kind of crowdsource the data into an application and model, or not model, but draw maps of what levels of air pollution are near a facility. So this is a challenge because there are a lot of the monitors, these handheld monitors, these very inexpensive monitors, have data challenges right now. But at the same time, they'll put out a tremendous amount of data. And a lot of this can lead to the public going to a facility with a huge database of unknown quality from unknown quality monitors that may or may not have been operated very well. Or they can be taking information to the states and saying you need to take some action in the states to getting this data dump with, again, unknown quality and unknown abilities in using the monitors. And this could be a real problem with just causing a lot of running around with that states would have to do. States would have to respond. And it also could put industry in a bind from a public relations perspective. So this is coming. EPA is training citizens. They're kind of playing this up in the environmental justice context. It's called they've got a citizen science toolbox, and expect more and more of this as the monitors improve. And this is getting now into compliance and enforcement. EPA, this is a slightly expansion of the concept of these advanced monitors or next generation monitors, to where EPA likes the fact that the public essentially can put more pressure on facilities, and that can be, and essentially EPA seeks more transparency, more information on websites, more community awareness regarding specific facilities. And in enforcement settlements, now EPA is starting to include monitoring, these fence line monitoring, third-party audits, remote sensing, data sharing on the internet, et cetera. So it's kind of a slight paradigm shift where the EPA is looking for partners amongst the citizens and different approaches to put a little pressure on sources and add to the amount of information the communities have. And some of the information is of questionable quality at this point. That is my update. I hope that this was useful to kind of set the stage for some later discussions. And we're probably running a little late, so I'm going to, unless somebody yells out a question, I'm going to turn it back to Bill.